Imagine a war that wasn't fought on the battlefield, yet decided the fate of nations. A silent game of strategy, intelligence, and deception. A country smaller than New Jersey, standing against one of the largest powers in the Middle East. Today, we unravel the story of how Israel outsmarted Iran, exposing secret operations, high-stakes missions, and a shadow war that the world barely knew existed. This is the moment where strategy became survival, and one misstep could change history forever. Stay with us, because every second reveals a move that could ignite the Middle East like never before. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. History is rarely decided in a single battle. More often, it unfolds in shadows, through intelligence networks, covert operations, diplomatic gambits, and strategic patience. The story of how Israel checkmated Iran is not simply the story of bombs and missiles. It is the story of a decades-long strategic chess match between two nations that never shared a border, yet stood locked in one of the most dangerous rivalries of the modern age. To understand this moment, we must go back long before the missiles flew. The birth of an enemy. In the early decades after Israel's creation in 1948, Iran was not an enemy at all. Under the rule of the Shah, Iran quietly cooperated with Israel. Trade flowed, intelligence was shared. But in 1979, the Iranian Revolution changed everything. When Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini seized power, Iran transformed into a revolutionary Islamic republic, and Israel became one of its most hated adversaries. Tehran declared Israel illegitimate. Israel, in turn, began viewing Iran as the greatest existential threat in the region. From that moment forward, the Middle East entered a new kind of war, a war fought mostly in silence, the shadow war. For decades, Israel and Iran fought what analysts call a shadow war. No formal declarations, no traditional battlefields. Instead, the conflict spread across intelligence operations, in cyber warfare, assassinations, and proxy militias. Iran built a network of allies across the Middle East, Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, the Assad regime in Syria, and groups like Hamas. This alliance became known as the Axis of Resistance. From Israel's perspective, Iran was attempting to surround it with hostile forces, missiles in Lebanon, militias in Syria. Rocket factories across the region? Israel responded with its own strategy, relentless disruption, airstrikes in Syria, covert sabotage of Iranian weapons shipments, and the mysterious targeting of nuclear scientists linked to Iran's atomic program. Every move was calculated. Every action meant to slow Iran's rise. The nuclear chessboard at the center of this rivalry was one terrifying possibility. A nuclear Iran. For Israel, a country barely the size of New Jersey, this was not a theoretical threat, it was existential. Iran insisted its nuclear program was peaceful. But Western intelligence agencies and Israeli analysts believed Tehran was moving closer to nuclear weapon capability. By the early 2000s, secret nuclear facilities had been discovered. The world reacted with sanctions and diplomacy. In 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, attempted to limit Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. For a moment, the crisis seemed contained. But the deal eventually collapsed and Iran resumed expanding its nuclear capabilities. The clock was ticking again, and Israel was watching. The strategy of prevention. Israel's strategy was built on a doctrine dating back decades. If a hostile power in the Middle East was close to obtaining nuclear weapons, Israel would strike first, This principle became known as the Begin Doctrine, named after Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. Begin Doctrine, the doctrine had already been tested. In 1981, Israel destroyed Iraq's nuclear reactor at Osirak. In 2007, it struck a suspected Syrian nuclear facility. The message was clear: Israel would never allow an enemy to build a nuclear bomb. Iran understood this, and yet the rivalry continued to escalate. The turning point: by the mid-2020s, tensions had reached a boiling point. Iran had developed advanced centrifuges capable of enriching uranium to very high levels. Israel saw the window for stopping Iran's nuclear program closing rapidly. Then the war entered a new phase: direct confrontation. In April 2024, Iran launched hundreds of drones and missiles toward Israel in retaliation for earlier strikes. For the first time, Iran attacked Israel openly rather than through proxies. The shadow war had stepped into the light. Israel's response would reshape the conflict. Precision and intelligence, years of preparation, suddenly became visible. Israeli intelligence had spent decades mapping Iranian military infrastructure, covert agents, satellite surveillance, and cyber operations, had quietly built a detailed blueprint of Iran's defenses. When Israel struck, it did not simply attack randomly. It targeted key nodes of Iran's military power: air defense systems, missile factories, command centers, nuclear research sites. In October 2024, Israeli strikes reportedly destroyed critical radar systems and missile batteries across Iran's defense network. Without those defenses, Iran's strategic shield began to weaken, and the chessboard shifted. The final moves: by early 2026, the conflict escalated dramatically. In a coordinated operation involving Israeli and American forces, known as Operation Lion's Roar, major strikes hit Iranian military and nuclear facilities. Operation Lion's Roar: explosions shook cities including Tehran, Isfahan, and Qom. Military commanders were killed. Infrastructure critical to Iran's nuclear ambitions was targeted. These strikes were designed not just to damage Iran's military. They were meant to dismantle the system that sustained it. In strategic terms, Israel was no longer playing defense. It was attempting to force a decisive checkmate. What checkmate means in war with pens, checkmate means in war with compete. Checkmate rarely means complete victory. It means forcing the opponent into a position where every move becomes dangerous. Israel's strategy aimed to achieve three objectives: delay or destroy Iran's nuclear program, break the power of Iran's regional proxy network, demonstrate overwhelming intelligence and technological superiority. Each strike sent a message: Israel could reach anywhere, at any time, against any target. In the language of strategy, unpredictability became its greatest weapon. Den twixt and times and twixt de dimtixt. The human cost, yet beneath the strategies and doctrines, there were human lives. Cities lived under air raid sirens. Families slept in shelters. Soldiers on both sides stepped into a war whose outcome was far beyond their control. War is never just about states. It is about people, about fear, about survival, and about the fragile hope that conflict might one day end. The long game, whether Israel truly checkmated Iran, remains a question history will debate for years. Because the truth about wars like this is simple: they rarely end with a final move. Instead, they reshape the board for the next generation. But one lesson is already clear: the Israel-Iran conflict proved that modern warfare is no longer defined only by armies and tanks. It is shaped by, in one, intelligence networks, cyber operations, political alliances, and strategies measured not in days, but in decades. The few stillness in these words subscribe to join this space of presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. In the decades before the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the relationship between Israel and Iran looked very different from what the world sees today. Iran, under the rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was not only friendly with Israel, but quietly maintained one of the most strategic partnerships in the Middle East. While many Arab nations rejected Israel after its creation in 1948, Iran chose a more pragmatic path. The Shah viewed Israel as a valuable partner against the rising tide of Arab nationalism and Soviet influence in the region. Both countries shared intelligence, traded goods, and cooperated in areas of agriculture, military development, and security. Israeli engineers helped develop Iranian infrastructure, while Iranian oil flowed into Israel at a time when many surrounding nations imposed strict boycotts. Behind the scenes, intelligence agencies from both nations, including Israel's Mossad and Iran's Savak, coordinated closely, exchanging information about mutual threats. For a brief moment in the complex political landscape of the Middle East, Israel and Iran stood on the same side of a quiet strategic alliance. But beneath the surface of modernization and cooperation, deep tensions were growing within Iranian society. The Shah's rule, supported by Western powers such as the United States and the United Kingdom, brought rapid modernization to Iran. Cities expanded, industries developed, and Western cultural influences spread through Iranian society. Yet many Iranians felt disconnected from this transformation. Economic inequality widened. Rural communities struggled while urban elites prospered. Religious leaders and traditionalists increasingly believed that the Shah's modernization was eroding Iran's Islamic identity and cultural heritage. Political opposition was suppressed, dissent was punished, and the Shah's secret police became notorious for their harsh tactics. Among the voices criticizing the regime was a cleric whose words would soon ignite a revolution, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini emerged as one of the most powerful critics of the Shah during the 1960s. He condemned the monarchy for its corruption, its authoritarianism, and its alignment with Western powers. In particular, he strongly opposed the Shah's relationship with Israel and the USK's, portraying them as symbols of foreign influence and domination over the Muslim world. Khomeini argued that Iran had abandoned its Islamic principles and had become too closely tied to Western political and cultural systems. His speeches resonated with many Iranians, who felt marginalized by the rapid changes sweeping their country. Although the Shah exiled Khomeini in 1964, first to Turkey and later to Iraq and France, exile did not silence him. From abroad, from Madrid, Khomeini continued delivering speeches and messages that were secretly distributed throughout Iran on cassette tapes and written pamphlets. These messages fueled growing anger against the monarchy. By the late 1970s, Iran was approaching a breaking point. Economic problems intensified as inflation rose and unemployment increased. Demonstrations erupted across major cities. What began as scattered protests soon grew into massive nationwide movements. Millions of Iranians filled the streets demanding political reform, social justice, and an end to the Shah's rule. Religious leaders, students, workers, and ordinary citizens united in opposition to the monarchy. The Shah's government responded with force, attempting to suppress the protests through arrests and military crackdowns. Yet each act of repression seemed to strengthen the resolve of the protesters, rather than weaken it. The streets of Tehran and other cities became scenes of tension, courage, and sacrifice as demonstrators faced armed soldiers while chanting slogans for change. As the protests intensified, the Shah's authority began to collapse. International pressure mounted, and even some of his closest allies began questioning whether his government could survive the growing unrest. In January 1979, the Shah made the decision that would mark the end of his reign. He left Iran officially for what he described as a temporary medical vacation, but in reality, he would never return. His departure created a power vacuum that rapidly transformed the political landscape of the country. Only weeks later, Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile to an extraordinary welcome. Millions of Iranians poured into the streets to greet him as the leader of the revolution. The monarchy that had ruled Iran for decades had fallen, replaced by a revolutionary movement determined to reshape the nation's identity and future. The revolution did not simply change Iran's political system. It transformed the country's worldview and its place in global politics. Under Khomeini's leadership, Iran became an Islamic republic, governed by a system that blended political authority with religious leadership. The new government rejected the Western-oriented policies of the Shah and declared independence from foreign influence. Anti-American and anti-Israeli rhetoric became central themes of the revolutionary ideology. Khomeini described Israel as an illegitimate state and accused it of oppressing Palestinians and undermining the Muslim world. In speeches that were broadcast across Iran and the broader region, he framed Israel as a symbol of Western interference in the Middle East. The Israeli embassy in Tehran was closed and handed over to representatives of the Palestinian cause, symbolizing the complete reversal of Iran's previous alliance with Israel. For Israel, the revolution represented a sudden and dramatic shift in regional dynamics. A country that had once been a quiet partner had now become one of its most vocal and determined adversaries. Israeli leaders watched closely as the new Iranian government began supporting movements and organizations that opposed Israel's existence. The rhetoric from Tehran was not merely political criticism, it was revolutionary language that called for resistance and confrontation. Iran's leadership began positioning itself as a champion of the Palestinian struggle and a defender of Islamic resistance against Israel. This ideological stance would shape Iranian foreign policy for decades to come. The revolution also inspired movements across the Middle East. Iran's new government sought to export its revolutionary ideals beyond its borders, encouraging groups and communities throughout the region to challenge established political systems and confront Western influence. Israel interpreted these actions as the beginning of a long-term strategic threat. Iranian support for militant organizations gradually expanded, particularly in Lebanon, where Hezbollah would later emerge as one of Israel's most powerful adversaries. What had once been a relationship based on cooperation had transformed into a deep ideological and geopolitical conflict. Inside Iran, the revolutionary government worked to consolidate power and build a new political structure that aligned with its vision of Islamic governance. Institutions were reshaped, the military was reorganized, and revolutionary guards were established to protect the new regime. The rhetoric against Israel continued to grow stronger, becoming a defining element of Iran's foreign policy narrative. Political rallies, state media, and official speeches frequently described Israel as a hostile force in the region. This messaging reinforced the idea that the struggle against Israel was not simply a political dispute, but a broader ideological confrontation. For Israel, the events of 1979 marked the beginning of a new era in Middle Eastern geopolitics. The loss of Iran as a strategic partner removed an important balance against other regional threats. At the same time, the emergence of a revolutionary government openly hostile to Israel created a challenge that would influence Israeli security planning for generations. Intelligence agencies began closely monitoring Iran's activities, attempting to understand the direction of the new regime and the potential risks it posed. Military strategists in Israel started considering scenarios that had once seemed unimaginable, a future in which Iran could become one of the most powerful opponents in the region. The revolution had reshaped alliances, redefined political identities, and ignited a rivalry that would stretch across decades. A partnership built quietly during the Cold War had been replaced by a confrontation fueled by ideology, security fears, and competing visions for the future of the Middle East. The events of 1979 did not produce an immediate war between Israel and Iran, but they planted the seeds of a conflict that would gradually unfold through proxy battles, intelligence operations, and strategic competition across the region. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. After the revolutionary transformation of Iran in 1979, open war between Iran and Israel did not erupt immediately. Instead, a far more complex and subtle confrontation began to take shape. It was a conflict fought largely in the shadows, away from traditional battlefields and official declarations. Military analysts would later describe it as a shadow war, a struggle defined by intelligence operations, covert actions, cyber warfare, and proxy forces scattered across the Middle East. The two countries rarely confronted each other directly, yet their influence collided repeatedly in distant cities, deserts, and secret facilities. For Israel, the emergence of a revolutionary Iranian government created a new strategic calculation. Iran was far larger in territory, population, and resources. Direct military confrontation would be unpredictable and potentially catastrophic for the region. Instead, Israeli planners focused on intelligence superiority and preemptive disruption. Israel's intelligence service, Mossad, began closely monitoring Iran's political structure, military development, and regional ambitions. Every new development in Iran's military capabilities was analyzed carefully, particularly any indication that the country might develop advanced missile systems or nuclear technology. Iran, on the other hand, began constructing a strategy designed to counter Israel without engaging in conventional warfare. Iranian leaders believed that Israel possessed overwhelming technological and military advantages, particularly with the support of the United States. Rather than confronting Israel directly, Iran began cultivating relationships with non-state actors and militant groups throughout the region. These groups would become the foundation of a broader network that analysts often refer to as Iran's axis of resistance. Through this network, Iran could project influence far beyond its borders while maintaining a level of strategic ambiguity. One of the most significant developments in this strategy emerged in Lebanon during the early 1980s. Amid the chaos of Lebanon's civil war and foreign interventions, Iran helped support the formation of a new militant organization that would later become one of the most powerful forces opposing Israel, Hezbollah. Hezbollah, with financial assistance, training, and ideological guidance from Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. Hezbollah grew rapidly in strength and influence. The organization positioned itself as a resistance movement against Israeli military presence in southern Lebanon. Over time, Hezbollah developed into a highly organized paramilitary force equipped with rockets, missiles, and sophisticated defensive tactics. For Israel, Hezbollah represented a new kind of threat, Unlike conventional armies, Hezbollah fighters were deeply embedded within local communities and operated with guerrilla tactics that made them difficult to eliminate. Rocket attacks from southern Lebanon periodically struck northern Israeli towns, creating constant tension along the border. Israeli military operations against Hezbollah often triggered cycles of escalation, drawing attention to the growing influence of Iran behind the scenes. Through Hezbollah, Iran had effectively established a strategic foothold close to Israel's borders. The shadow war expanded beyond Lebanon as Iran deepened its involvement with other regional actors. In the Palestinian territories, groups such as Hamas and Islamic Jihad received varying degrees of financial and military support from Tehran. While these groups maintained their own agendas and leadership structures, Iran viewed them as part of a broader resistance movement against Israel. This support allowed Iran to influence conflicts in Gaza and the West Bank without deploying its own soldiers directly. The pattern was becoming clear. Iran would empower local forces that could challenge Israel from multiple directions. Israel responded with a strategy of constant vigilance and targeted disruption. Israeli intelligence agencies developed extensive networks throughout the region, gathering information on weapons shipments, training camps, and military planning connected to Iranian activities. When Israeli leaders believed that a threat was growing too dangerous, they often chose to act preemptively. Covert operations targeted supply routes, arms depots, and key individuals linked to Iran's expanding network of allies. Many of these operations were never officially acknowledged, but reports from journalists and intelligence analysts painted a picture of a quiet and relentless struggle. Weapons convoys traveling through Syria toward Hezbollah positions in Lebanon were frequently struck by mysterious air raids. Iranian military advisors operating near Israeli borders were sometimes targeted in precision attacks. Facilities believed to be connected to missile development or advanced weaponry occasionally suffered unexplained explosions or sabotage. Each incident reflected the same strategic principle: prevent Iran from strengthening its ability to threaten Israel. Syria gradually became one of the central arenas of this shadow conflict. As the Syrian civil war erupted in 2011, Iran moved quickly to support the government of Bashar al-Assad. Iranian advisors, Revolutionary Guard units, and allied militias entered Syria to assist the Syrian government in maintaining control. This intervention dramatically expanded Iran's military presence near Israel's northern frontier. For Israel, the possibility of Iranian forces and advanced weapon systems becoming permanently established in Syria represented a serious strategic danger. Israeli air power began carrying out frequent strikes within Syrian territory, targeting facilities and convoys believed to be linked to Iranian military expansion. These operations were often conducted with remarkable precision, hitting specific warehouses, radar installations, and missile depots. Although Israel rarely confirmed responsibility for each strike, international observers widely interpreted them as part of Israel's effort to prevent Iran from building a permanent military infrastructure in Syria. At the same time, the shadow war moved into an entirely new domain: cyberspace. Cyber warfare became an increasingly important tool for both sides. One of the most famous incidents involved the Stuxnet computer virus, a highly sophisticated piece of malware that targeted Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities. The virus caused centrifuges used in uranium enrichment to malfunction, damaging Iran's nuclear program without requiring a traditional military attack. While no government publicly claimed responsibility, cybersecurity experts widely believe that the operation was carried out through cooperation between Israeli and American intelligence agencies. Iran responded by developing its own cyber capabilities. Iranian cyber units began targeting Israeli infrastructure, government networks, and private companies. These attacks ranged from attempts to steal sensitive information to efforts aimed at disrupting critical services. In this new digital battlefield, both nations sought to exploit vulnerabilities in each other's technological systems while avoiding actions that might trigger open war. The Shadow War also included a series of mysterious assassinations involving scientists and military officials associated with Iran's nuclear program. Several Iranian nuclear researchers were killed in operations that Iranian authorities blamed on Israeli intelligence service. These incidents intensified tensions between the two countries and reinforced the perception that Israel was determined to slow or sabotage Iran's progress toward advanced military technology. Each covert action carried risks. Any operation could provoke retaliation or trigger a wider confrontation, yet both sides appeared determined to maintain the conflict within the ambiguous space between peace and war. The struggle became a long strategic contest, defined by patience, intelligence gathering, and carefully calculated moves. Within Israel's military and intelligence communities, analysts studied every sign of Iranian expansion with increasing concern. The growth of missile arsenals in Lebanon, the presence of Iranian advisors in Syria, and the development of advanced weapon systems all suggested that Iran was gradually constructing a network capable of surrounding Israel with hostile forces. This perception influenced Israel's long-term defense planning and reinforced its commitment to maintaining technological and intelligence superiority. In Tehran, leaders viewed the same developments as a necessary response to Israel's military strength and regional alliances. Iranian officials often argued that supporting resistance movements across the Middle East was essential for balancing Israeli power and defending the interests of the broader Muslim world. Each side interpreted its actions as defensive, while viewing the other as the aggressor. Over the years, the Shadow War grew more sophisticated and more dangerous. Intelligence agencies expanded their operations, cyber capabilities became increasingly advanced, and proxy forces accumulated larger arsenals of rockets and missiles. The conflict was rarely visible at a single dramatic moment, yet its effects were felt across the region. Airstrikes, sabotage operations, and proxy battles continued. Shah pinged the balance of power between Israel and Iran, quietly intensifying the rivalry that had begun with the revolution decades earlier. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to join 3 Space of Presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. As the shadow war between Israel and Iran continued to unfold across the Middle East, one issue gradually rose above all others in shaping the fears, strategies, and decisions of both nations. Iran's nuclear ambitions. Nuclear technology had long been part of Iran's national development plans, dating back to the era of the Shah, when Western countries actually supported Tehran's efforts to build nuclear energy infrastructure. But after the 1979 revolution transformed Iran into an Islamic republic, the nature and intentions of its nuclear program became the subject of intense global scrutiny. For Israel, the possibility that Iran might eventually acquire nuclear weapons represented the most serious threat imaginable. Iran consistently maintained that its nuclear program was designed for peaceful purposes. Iranian officials argued that nuclear technology was essential for energy production, scientific progress, and national independence. They pointed out that Iran, like many other nations, had the right to develop nuclear energy under international law. Iranian leaders also emphasized that their country had signed international agreements regulating nuclear activity, and had allowed inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency to monitor certain facilities. Yet suspicions continued to grow among Western governments and intelligence agencies. Evidence began to emerge that Iran had secretly constructed nuclear facilities that had not been reported to international authorities. In the early 2000s, the discovery of hidden nuclear sites raised alarms across the world. Satellite imagery and intelligence reports revealed the existence of enrichment facilities in locations such as Natanz in Iraq. These facilities were capable of processing uranium, a material that can be used both for civilian nuclear energy and for nuclear weapons if enriched to very high levels. The distinction between peaceful and military nuclear development became the center of a global debate. Governments in Europe, the United States, and the Middle East began asking the same urgent question: how close was Iran to developing a nuclear weapon? For Israel, the answer to that question carried enormous significance. Israel is a relatively small country surrounded by regional tensions and historical conflicts. Many Israeli leaders believed that even the possibility of a hostile government possessing nuclear weapons posed an unacceptable risk to their nation's survival. Statements from Iranian officials describing Israel as illegitimate or calling for resistance against it only intensified these fears. Israeli policymakers began to see Iran's nuclear program not as a distant concern, but as a direct and immediate strategic challenge. The Israeli response was shaped by a doctrine rooted in earlier experiences. Decades earlier, Israel had taken decisive military action to prevent potential enemies from developing nuclear capabilities. In 1981, Israeli fighter jets carried out a surprise strike against Iraq's nuclear reactor at Osirak, destroying the facility before it could become operational. Years later, in 2007, Israel conducted another covert airstrike against a suspected nuclear reactor in Syria. These operations reflected a strategic belief that waiting for an enemy to complete a nuclear weapon could be far more dangerous than taking preventive action. This philosophy became widely known as the Begin Doctrine, named after Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. Applying that doctrine to Iran, however, presented far greater challenges. Unlike Iraq or Syria, Iran's nuclear program was vast, complex, and deeply dispersed across multiple locations. Many facilities were built underground or protected by sophisticated defensive systems. Some were located deep within mountainous terrain, making them extremely difficult to destroy through conventional airstrikes. Israeli military planners understood that eliminating Iran's nuclear infrastructure would require an operation far more complicated than previous missions. At the same time, Israel began investing heavily in intelligence efforts aimed at understanding the full scope of Iran's nuclear activities. Mossad agents, satellite surveillance systems, and cyber intelligence units worked together to gather detailed information about nuclear scientists, research centers, enrichment facilities, and supply chains connected to the program. This intelligence effort extended far beyond Iran's borders, tracking international networks that might provide technology or materials useful for nuclear development. One of the most unusual aspects of this struggle was the increasing role of cyber warfare. Instead of relying solely on bombs or missiles, Israeli and allied intelligence agencies began exploring ways to sabotage Iran's nuclear progress through digital means. The most famous example was the Stuxnet cyber operation, a sophisticated computer virus designed to infiltrate Iran's nuclear facilities and disrupt the operation of uranium enrichment centrifuges. Once inside the system, the malware caused the machines to spin at abnormal speeds, damaging them while concealing the malfunction from monitoring systems. The attack slowed Iran's enrichment program without creating visible destruction or immediate casualties. But despite these setbacks, Iran continued expanding its nuclear capabilities. New centrifuge designs were developed, and uranium enrichment gradually increased. International pressure intensified as governments attempted to prevent the situation from escalating toward a nuclear crisis. Diplomatic negotiations began between Iran and several major world powers, including the United States, Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom, and Germany. After years of negotiations, these efforts produced a landmark agreement in 2015 known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Under the terms of the agreement, Iran accepted strict limitations on its nuclear activities. Uranium enrichment levels were capped, the number of operating centrifuges was reduced, and international inspectors were granted expanded access to nuclear facilities. In exchange, many of the economic sanctions that had been imposed on Iran were lifted, allowing the country greater access to global trade and financial systems. Supporters of the agreement argued that it significantly reduced the risk of Iran developing a nuclear weapon, at least for the duration of the deal. Israel's leadership remained deeply skeptical of the agreement. Israeli officials argued that the restrictions were temporary and that Iran could resume expanding its nuclear program once the limitations expired. They also warned that the financial benefits Iran received from sanctions relief might strengthen its regional influence and support for allied groups across the Middle East. Israeli leaders publicly criticized the agreement and urged international partners to maintain pressure on Iran. Over time, tensions surrounding the nuclear deal began to grow again. Changes in political leadership, shifting alliances, and disagreements over compliance weakened the stability of the agreement. Eventually, the United States withdrew from the deal and reinstated economic sanctions on Iran. In response, Iran gradually reduced its compliance with certain restrictions, increasing uranium enrichment levels and installing more advanced centrifuges. Once again, the world faced growing uncertainty about the future of Iran's nuclear program. For Israeli strategists, the situation appeared increasingly urgent. Intelligence assessments suggested that Iran was shortening the time it would need to produce weapons-grade uranium if it chose to pursue nuclear weapons. Military planners began considering a wide range of scenarios, including the possibility of direct strikes against nuclear facilities. At the same time, covert efforts to slow Iran's progress reportedly continued through sabotage operations, cyber activities, and intelligence missions. Iran, meanwhile, framed its nuclear program as a symbol of national sovereignty and technological achievement. Iranian officials argued that international pressure and sanctions were attempts to deny their country the right to scientific advancement. Within Iran, nuclear development became a point of national pride, reinforcing public support for continuing the program despite external pressure. Across the Middle East, the possibility of a nuclear-armed Iran reshaped strategic calculations for many countries. Governments throughout the region watched closely, aware that the balance of power could change dramatically if Iran achieved a nuclear capability. Diplomatic efforts, intelligence operations, and military planning all revolved around the same central question: whether Iran's nuclear ambitions would ultimately be contained, delayed, or transformed into a new and dangerous reality. As the rivalry between Israel and Iran intensified over the decades, the conflict gradually began shifting from quiet intelligence battles and proxy confrontations toward moments of direct and visible confrontation. For years, both sides had carefully avoided open warfare, relying instead on covert operations and regional alliances to challenge each other's influence. But as Iran expanded its military capabilities and extended its presence across the Middle East, Israel increasingly felt that the strategic balance was changing in dangerous ways. What had once been a distant rivalry began moving closer to Israel's borders, forcing Israeli leaders to take more direct action. One of the key arenas where this confrontation unfolded was Syria. When the Syrian civil war erupted in 2011, it created a chaotic and unpredictable battlefield that drew in regional and international powers. Iran quickly recognized the importance of Syria to its broader strategic goals. The Syrian government, under Bashar al-Assad, was one of Iran's most important allies in the Middle East, and losing that alliance would weaken Iran's influence across the region. Iranian military advisors, members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and allied militia fighters began entering Syria to support the Syrian government against rebel forces. This growing Iranian presence in Syria alarmed Israeli military planners. Syria shared a direct border with Israel, and any permanent Iranian military infrastructure there could potentially threaten Israeli territory. Intelligence reports indicated that Iran was attempting to establish bases, supply routes, and weapons storage facilities within Syria. Some of these sites were believed to house advanced missile systems capable of reaching deep into Israeli territory. For Israel, allowing Iran to build a strong military foothold so close to its borders was seen as an unacceptable risk. Israel responded with a series of precise and carefully planned military operations inside Syrian territory. These strikes were usually carried out by the Israeli Air Force and targeted locations believed to be connected to Iranian military expansion. Weapons, convoys moving from Iran through Iraq and Syria toward Hezbollah positions in Lebanon were frequent targets. Warehouses suspected of storing missiles or advanced weapons systems were struck in nighttime raids. Radar installations and air defense systems that could protect Iranian assets were also targeted. Although Israel rarely confirmed responsibility for individual strikes, international observers widely attributed these operations to Israeli efforts to limit Iran's military presence in Syria. These operations required extraordinary levels of intelligence coordination. Israeli surveillance systems, satellites, and reconnaissance aircraft monitored movements across the region, tracking shipments and identifying key locations connected to Iranian military networks. Once a target was identified, military planners would evaluate the risks and timing of a strike. The goal was not to trigger a large-scale war, but to gradually weaken Iran's ability to project power near Israel's borders. Each operation was calculated to send a clear message while avoiding unnecessary escalation. At the same time, Iran continued strengthening its alliances with regional groups that opposed Israel. Hezbollah in Lebanon had grown into one of the most powerful non-state military forces in the world. Over the years, the organization had accumulated a vast arsenal of rockets and missiles, many believed to have been supplied or supported by Iran. These weapons posed a significant threat to Israeli cities and infrastructure. Israeli leaders understood that any large-scale conflict with Hezbollah could involve thousands of rockets being launched toward Israeli territory. To counter this threat, Israel invested heavily in defensive systems such as the Iron Dome missile defense network, designed to intercept incoming rockets. At the same time, Israeli intelligence agencies worked continuously to identify Hezbollah. Weapons depots, command centers, and missile launch sites The possibility of a future war between Israel and Hezbollah remained one of the most serious concerns in Israeli defense planning, and Iran's role in supporting Hezbollah made it a central factor in the broader confrontation. Occasionally, the shadow conflict between Israel and Iran moved beyond covert actions into more visible clashes. Airstrikes inside Syria sometimes targeted not only infrastructure but also Iranian military personnel. These incidents increased tensions between the two countries as Iran condemned the strikes and promised retaliation. In some cases, Iranian forces or allied militias launched rockets toward Israeli territory from Syrian positions. Israel responded with further strikes, creating a cycle of escalation that brought the two adversaries closer to direct confrontation than ever before. The conflict also extended beyond Syria and Lebanon into the seas surrounding the Middle East. Reports began emerging of mysterious attacks on oil tankers and cargo ships linked to both countries, Some vessels experienced explosions or sabotage while traveling through key maritime routes, such as the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. Analysts believe that these incidents were part of the ongoing struggle between Israeli and Iranian intelligence services, each side attempting to disrupt the other's economic and logistical networks. The maritime dimension of the conflict demonstrated how far the rivalry had spread, reaching well beyond traditional battlefields. Meanwhile, technological advancements were changing the nature of the confrontation. Iran invested heavily in the development of ballistic missiles and drone technology. These systems allowed Iran to project military power across long distances without deploying large numbers of troops. Drones, in particular, became an increasingly important tool. In modern warfare across the Middle East, Iranian-designed drones were used by allied groups in several regional conflicts, and Israeli defense systems had to adapt quickly to counter these evolving threats. Israel, known for its technological innovation, responded by developing sophisticated detection and interception systems capable of identifying drones and missiles before they reached their targets. Israeli defense planners understood that the future of warfare in the region would involve not only traditional aircraft and missiles, but also autonomous systems and cyber capabilities. Maintaining technological superiority became one of Israel's primary strategic objectives. At the diplomatic level, Israel also worked to strengthen alliances with other countries concerned about Iran's growing influence. Several Arab states in the region had their own concerns about Iran's regional ambitions in missile development. Quiet security cooperation between Israel and some of these countries gradually expanded, particularly in areas such as intelligence sharing and defense technology. Over time, these relationships contributed to a shifting geopolitical landscape in which Israel was no longer as isolated in the region as it had once been. Iran viewed these developments with suspicion, interpreting new alliances and military cooperation as part of a broader effort to contain its influence. Iranian officials continued emphasizing their commitment to supporting resistance movements and maintaining strategic depth across the Middle East. Military exercises, missile tests, and public statements reinforced Iran's determination to remain a powerful force in regional politics. As the years passed, the number of direct encounters between Israeli and Iranian forces slowly increased. Airstrikes, drone interceptions, cyber attacks, and proxy battles became more frequent, creating an atmosphere of constant tension. Each incident carried the risk of triggering a wider conflict that could involve multiple countries and destabilize the entire region. Military commanders on both sides were aware that a single miscalculation could lead to a confrontation far larger than either nation intended. The rivalry between Israel and Iran had evolved into a complex and dangerous strategic contest. What began as ideological hostility following the Iranian Revolution had transformed into a multi-layered conflict involving air power, missile technology, intelligence operations, cyber warfare, and regional alliances. Every strike, every intercepted missile, and every covert operation reflected a deeper struggle over influence, security, and the balance of power across the Middle East. As years of rivalry, covert operations, and strategic confrontations unfolded between Israel and Iran, the conflict gradually began shaping a much larger geopolitical reality across the Middle East. What once appeared to be a bilateral struggle between two distant states had grown into a complex regional contest involving alliances, proxy forces, technological competition, and shifting diplomatic relationships. The phrase geopolitical checkmate began appearing in discussions among analysts and policymakers, not because the conflict had reached a final conclusion, but because Israel's strategy increasingly aimed to place Iran in a position where every major move carried serious risks and consequences. The foundation of this strategic pressure rested on several pillars developed over decades. One of the most important was intelligence superiority. Israeli intelligence agencies had spent years building networks capable of monitoring Iranian military movements, technological development, and regional activities. Satellite surveillance, cyber intelligence, human informants, and advanced data analysis allowed Israeli planners to track developments across a wide geographic area, stretching from Iran itself to Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and beyond. This information created a strategic advantage by allowing Israel to anticipate threats before they fully emerged. At the same time, Israel's ability to conduct precise military operations reinforced this advantage. Over the years, Israeli air and intelligence operations had repeatedly demonstrated the ability to strike specific targets with remarkable accuracy. These operations were often designed not to provoke full-scale war, but to disrupt critical components of Iran's strategic infrastructure. Weapons depots, missile convoys, radar systems, and research facilities linked to advanced military technologies were all potential targets. Each successful strike sent a signal across the region that Israeli intelligence and military reach extended far beyond its borders. The effect of this strategy was cumulative rather than immediate. Iran continued expanding its influence through regional alliances and proxy forces, but every expansion also exposed new vulnerabilities. Supply routes stretching across Iraq and Syria could be monitored and sometimes disrupted. Military installations built to strengthen Iranian presence near Israel's borders often faced the risk of sudden airstrikes. Even inside Iran, sensitive facilities had occasionally been targeted by sabotage operations or cyber attacks that slowed technological progress. The result was a strategic environment in which Iran could advance its ambitions, but rarely without facing constant pressure. Another factor shaping this geopolitical contest was the changing network of alliances across the Middle East. For much of the 20th century, Israel had been relatively isolated within the region, surrounded by states that often viewed it as an adversary. Over time, however, the regional balance began shifting. Several countries that once maintained distance from Israel started reconsidering their positions, particularly as concerns about Iran's regional influence grew. Quiet diplomatic contacts evolved into more open forms of cooperation in areas such as security coordination, intelligence sharing, and technological partnerships. These new relationships altered the strategic landscape. Countries that shared concerns about missile development, regional militias, and expanding Iranian influence increasingly viewed cooperation with Israel as a practical security measure. Military exercises, defense technology exchanges, and diplomatic agreements gradually strengthened connections that had once been politically difficult to imagine. For Israel, this shift represented a major strategic achievement. By building partnerships with other regional powers, Israel reduced its isolation and created a broader network capable of counterbalancing Iran's influence. Iran, meanwhile, maintained its own network of alliances built through years of political support, military assistance, and ideological alignment. Groups such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, various militias in Iraq, and other allied organizations, ACRO. The region formed a decentralized but powerful structure, often described as Iran's axis of resistance. These groups allowed Iran to project influence into areas far from its borders and created multiple fronts through which pressure could be applied against Israel and its allies. The existence of these proxy networks made the conflict far more complicated than a traditional military rivalry. Any major confrontation between Israel and Iran risked spreading quickly into several different countries. Rocket attacks from Lebanon, clashes in Syria, militia activity in Iraq, or disruptions in international shipping routes could all become part of the same wider conflict. This interconnected structure created both strength and vulnerability for Iran's strategy. While proxy groups extended Iranian reach, they also created multiple points where Israeli intelligence and military operations could attempt to weaken that network. Technological competition also played a critical role in shaping the geopolitical balance. Iran invested heavily in missile programs, drone technology, and asymmetric warfare capabilities designed to challenge technologically advanced opponents. Ballistic missiles capable of traveling hundreds or even thousands of kilometers became central elements of Iran's defense strategy. Drone technology, which allowed relatively inexpensive unmanned systems to conduct reconnaissance or strike missions, also became an increasingly important part of regional warfare. Israel responded by expanding its own technological defenses. Systems designed to intercept rockets, drones, and ballistic missiles became vital components of Israel's national security infrastructure. Multi-layered missile defense networks were developed to detect incoming threats and destroy them before they could reach populated areas. These systems were supported by advanced radar networks, artificial intelligence analysis tools, and rapid response military units capable of reacting quickly to emerging threats. The constant competition between offensive and defensive technologies created a dynamic strategic environment in which both sides sought advantages without crossing the threshold into full-scale war. Every new missile system, drone platform, or cyber capability introduced new possibilities and new risks. Military planners on both sides understood that technological breakthroughs could quickly alter the balance of power. Economic pressure also became a significant element of the broader geopolitical contest. Sanctions imposed on Iran by international coalitions affected the country's financial system, oil exports, and access to global markets. These sanctions were often linked to concerns about nuclear development, missile programs, and regional activities. While Iran continued finding ways to adapt to economic restrictions, the sanctions created long-term challenges for economic growth and technological development. At the same time, Israel's economic and technological sectors continued expanding through global partnerships and innovation. Israeli companies became leaders in fields such as cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and advanced defense systems. This technological ecosystem not only strengthened Israel's economy, but also enhanced its strategic capabilities, allowing it to develop new tools for intelligence gathering, defense, and military play. The geopolitical contest between Israel and Iran gradually became one of the defining strategic rivalries of the modern Middle East. It influenced diplomatic negotiations, military planning, and regional alliances across multiple countries. Governments throughout the region monitored developments carefully, aware that shifts in this rivalry could reshape political stability, economic relationships, and security dynamics. Despite the intensity of the competition, both sides appeared cautious about triggering a full-scale war that could devastate the region. The presence of advanced weapons, powerful alliances, and global economic connections meant that any large conflict could escalate rapidly beyond the control of its original participants. Strategic pressure, intelligence operations, and limited confrontations, therefore, remained the preferred methods for managing the rivalry. Within this complex geopolitical environment, the idea of a strategic checkmate did not necessarily mean total victory or permanent defeat. Instead, it referred to the gradual shaping of a strategic landscape in which one side could limit the options available to the other. Through intelligence superiority, technological innovation, military readiness, and evolving regional alliances, Israel aimed to create conditions in which Iran's expansion of power would face constant obstacles and growing strategic costs. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to join these space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.